Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. President. Sorry, my former career, I did come from the other place. It still stays with me sometimes. When the Labor government introduced the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, the MRRT, that the Coalition now seeks to repeal, it was a proud moment. And it was a moment when, in this Parliament, we recognise the importance and the strength of mining to our nation. Mining is an industry that has built and sustained communities across Australia, not least in my home state of Tasmania. In fact, in Tasmania, towns have been built on foundations of metal and ore, from the rich ranges of the west to the rivers of tin in the east, and from seams of coal in the south and scheelite in the windswept islands of Bass Strait. Tasmania has known the benefits that mining can bring to regions, just as Western Australia and Queensland are now experiencing such a thing. Towns can boom, swelling with workers from across the state, across the country and across the world. In fact, some of Australia's most significant cultural events have occurred as a result of the beacon that mining has been able to provide. And as an interesting aside, as much as an influx of Chinese miners and prospectors caused tension in Victoria and across the goldfields, the same wave of Chinese entrepreneurship in the tin fields of northeast Tasmania aroused both curiosity and admiration. The different experience in Tasmania meant that adoptive son of a Chinese family could be elected as early as 1913. Thomas Jerome Backup, his involvement in public debate had begun prior to 1900, as discussions of federation were moving towards a model of nationhood that would restrict non-white immigration. When he was elected to the Australian Senate after a stint as member for the state seat of Bass, he proclaimed his Chinese heritage and spoke out against white Australia. Backup understood the contribution that Chinese miners and hard-working migrant labour had made to their adoptive communities. And he understood, as a former shop owner and tin miner, the contribution that mines and minerals made to the communities in which they were situated. But the Tasmanian experience also shows that mines must be managed properly to build sustainable communities, communities that don't just dry up and disappear when the deposit is depleted or no longer economical to extract. Governments must be mindful of both the good fortune and the finitude of the resource in every region, and the responsibility that confers upon government as custodians of the common good. And it is with that in mind that I draw upon Senator Williams' contribution to this debate this evening. Because, as he stated, he believes that minerals in the ground do belong to the people. Well, if minerals in the ground do belong to the people, then he would not be choosing to vote for this repeal bill before us, because it is with that premise in mind that this bill came about in the first place. The fact that the minerals in the ground do belong to the people and that we all do have a share in them. We must take the profit generated by the resource that is in the ground and redirect it to where it is needed and where it will do the most good. We have to support people who have contributed to the social and economic environment that make profit-making and prosperity possible, and we have to help invest in things that keep our communities alive. The risk, of course, is that the benefits of mining are all too short-lived. It is the case that the markets for Australia's mining resources are often these days overseas, with some notable exceptions such as the zinc works in my hometown of Hobart and the coal-fired power plants of mainland Australia, plants that are rapidly becoming less and less sustainable in Australia compared to renewable energy generation. But given the bulk of markets are currently and are likely to remain export markets, much of our resource ends up overseas. We must therefore retain the value of the ore in our soil by extracting as much monetary value for it as we can, a task at which Australian businesses are adept and ensuring that profit remains in the nation from which it is originally derived. And that is exactly what the MRRT is designed to do. Just as state and territory governments exercised their ownership of mineral deposits at the start of the 20th century, licensing out exploration and extraction rights in return for royalties, the MRRT is underpinned by the fact that Australia's mineral resources are owned by all of us, something that Senator Williams even acknowledged himself. All Australians deserve to share in the extraordinary, unprecedented wealth that has been generated by the mining industry over recent years. Naturally, state-based royalties do attempt to cover part of this task, but the incredible profits returned by mining companies by virtue of high demand, strong prices, and other factors are not adequately accounted for by volumetric royalties alone. State and territory royalties do not and have not kept pace with the profits of mining companies because they reflect a fundamentally different measure of activity. The fact is that as profits increase, Australians deserve a share of the fortune reaped from minerals they have gifted to those companies. That social share of profits can come in many forms. I've already spoken about royalties, but there are other social dividends of mining. During the construction phase of a mining project, when profits are relatively low, a dividend is delivered to communities in the form of jobs and wages, an investment in the construction of infrastructure that supports towns and regions, as well as the mines themselves. But as construction comes to an end, employment scales down and companies generate huge revenues without corresponding social benefit. In fact, while profits in the mining industry grew by some 262% over the decade to 2012, when the MRRT was introduced by the Labor government, only 7% of Australia's employment growth was a result of the mining industry. Unlike other industries, for example the building industries, which often functions as a proxy for the economy as a whole, there are relatively few sectors indirectly linked to mining. Profits made by these companies remain extremely concentrated in and restricted to the mining sector itself, leading to the phenomenon of a two-speed economy that Australians understand all too well. It is either naive or disingenuous, therefore, for the Coalition to assert that Labor ever imagined that the MRRT would be a constant and immediate source of revenue for government. Comparable initiatives, such as the PRRT, show that initial periods of profit-based taxes generate relatively little government revenue. But in these periods, it is usually the case that companies are delivering different types of return to communities. As I said, the construction of jobs and wages, or adequate royalty payments, or simply do not have the types of revenue for which the MRRT is designed. But the MRRT was never supposed to be a scheme for the next 6 months. It was to account for the boom periods when mining companies are generating huge wealth and little social benefit relative to that wealth. The frequency and regularity of those periods increases when the sector is booming, when prices on volumes are high, and when deductions in the form of depreciations on the market values have been run down. The notion that the MRRT has not performed as expected is not borne out by any assessment of the deliberate design of the scheme. It is, like so much of what government says, a hollow three-word slogan. But as Australians will never have the opportunity now to benefit from these boom periods in the mining industry if the Coalition gets its way, we will never actually see the fruits that it would produce. And Mr. President, Mr. Acting Deputy President, I want to take you through some of the areas in which Australians stand to lose from this bill and the repeal of the MRRT, many of which the Coalition has included under the vague an obfuscatory heading of associated measures. The Coalition will start the cuts early on in the lives of Australians, targeting the measuring aims at supporting families in giving their kids educational opportunities. Labor introduced a payment of $205 for each child in primary school and $410 for each child in secondary school, last paid in July 2013 under the Labor government. This assistance would have been paid again to around 35,000 Tasmanian families in January this year if the Coalition had decided that children's education was worth supporting, but instead they decided that kids were an easy target in their phony budget emergency campaign before the election. This assistance follows from its predecessor, the education tax refund. Up to 7,250 families in my home state in Tasmania with legitimate claims to the education tax refund missed out on their deductions. And so the direct method of payment, termed the School Kids Bonus by the Labor government, was one of the recommendations of the Henry Tax Review, commissioned by the Labor government, designed to make that tax simpler and fairer, tax system that is. But unlike the education tax refund, you do not need to claim the School Kids Bonus or keep receipts for education expenses, because Labor understood that there are costs in educating kids that families necessarily have to shoulder, and costs for which they deserve support. And so, cruelest of all, this is not even a payment in any way linked to the MRRT, yet despite the Coalition's rhetoric, it will increase the cost of living pressures on families in Australia who need it least at a time when they need it the most. It is simply about targeting low and middle income families in an effort at ideological purity. And it is the same rationale that the Coalition applies in repealing the income support bonus, a tax-free payment of $211.60 that goes to Australians who are most in need of it. Perhaps the most discussed beneficiaries of this payment are the children of soldiers killed or seriously injured in service, children of veterans aged under 16 years who are homeless or living away from home, or those under 25 who are unemployed or studying full-time would have been entitled to receive this payment. But in their infinite wisdom, the Coalition has decided that these people do not deserve our country's support. Their sacrifice, it seems, means so little to the Coalition that they are unwilling to support them when they need it most. As if it were a defence of this callous action, the Prime Minister has insisted that, and I quote, "There are tens of thousands of people who will lose the income support bonus, and I don't suppose any of them will be very happy to lose it." Well, he was right on that. But this idea that the children of veterans are somehow being singled out for mistreatment by a government is simply false. It's an outrageous smear. Well, it is difficult to understand how the Prime Minister can consider a provision of their legislation, their own doing, their own legislation, as an outrageous smear. But he is correct in saying that the collateral damage of the Coalition's championing of the wealthy and powerful is broader than just the children of war veterans. The victims of the Coalition's cuts also include those people receiving, and the list is long, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Let me start with Ab-Study Living Allowance, Austudy, Exceptional Circumstances Payment, New Start Allowance, Parenting Payment, Sickness Allowance, Special Benefits, Transitional Farm Family Payment, Youth Allowance. And its repeal is, as you would expect, opposed by New South Wales Return and Service League, RSL, as well as National Seniors Australia and other groups concerned with the welfare of vulnerable Australians. Mr. Acting Deputy President, when the MRRT is also heralded a chance to secure Australia's future by building a stronger superannuation sector, compulsory superannuation, of course, is a Labor government achievement that guarantees not only the well-being and personal financial security of retirees, but also the nation's financial security. Among the very many economic achievements of the Keating Labor government, superannuation stands out as one of the most important and enduring features of Labor reform. So important and so positive has superannuation been to this nation that the Prime Minister felt obliged to promise, when he was opposition leader, no adverse changes to superannuation. But those platitudes offered by the Prime Minister have, like so many of the sentiments he has expressed, failed to survive the transition of him becoming Prime Minister and coming into government. Buried in this bill before the Senate is the axing of the low-income superannuation contribution, a move that will increase superannuation taxes on 1 in 3 of Australia's lowest paid workers. Indeed, within weeks, the government has sought to both cut the super of millions of Australians earning up to $37,000, while boosting the super for 16,000 people who have over $2 million in their super balances. That makes it very clear which end of town this government supports. Has no support at all for low-income workers, for those low-income Australians that would have sought to benefit under the previous Labor government's low-income superannuation contribution. And it also speaks volumes for the Coalition's priorities that any scheme designed to redress inequality or support low-income earners so that they can live with security and dignity and opportunity is scrapped in favour of increasing the wealth of the wealthy. For high-income earners, superannuation can be concessional. For low-income earners, there aren't effective incentives for low-income earners to contribute to their superannuation. That is shameful. This measure addresses that issue. Of course, disproportionate among the low-income earners catered for are women, which is worth noting. More than 2.1 million women, of whom are affected by this change. A significant percentage of these, of course, are mothers working part-time while looking after their children. This is exactly the part of a woman's career where an additional $500 a year going into their superannuation will be of most benefit for building savings for their retirement. Not content with stripping these benefits from here on in, the Coalition is backdating this cut and implementing this tax measure retrospectively, a fact confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Office's checking of the Coalition's election costings. Low-income earners entered the 2013-14 financial year on the understanding they would be refunded their superannuation tax. Partway through this financial year, and the government has shifted the goalposts to make it harder for low-income earners. And far from helping out the Australian economy, when you combine this move with the delay in increasing the super guarantee to 12%, national savings and economic security will be hit by $53 billion by 2021-22. This means a reduction in available capital for infrastructure investment by around $5 billion based on current industry-wide asset allocations. The Coalition has complained falsely about a flight of investment from the mining sector because of the MRRT. But the worst thing we can do for investment security is to make capital harder to access, exactly what this associated measures of this bill does. Labor will oppose this bill. Labor will oppose the removal of the MRRT and the associated measures. And because the Labor Party believes in Australians, we believe in our students, our job seekers, our families and our kids. and the descendants of women and men who sacrificed their lives for our country because we believe in them. That's why we will oppose this bill.
Thank you, Senator Singh.